good. So like you, I've had many lives as a serial entrepreneur, and I've experienced up and downs. It drives some people to drink. In my case, it drove me to cannabis. Cannabis, if you've been around or reading the newspapers right now, it's a tumultuous, interesting time where we're seeing companies that have billion-dollar valuations drop a couple $1 billion here. We built a $100 million greenhouse, and next week it's on the chopping block for pennies on the dollar. So this is the industry that people are seeing in the newspapers and playing out on the news. We are a tech provider in the space, and what we do is we help to understand how cannabis interacts with medical patients and how it works recreationally as well, based on the way that it affects people. There's a lot of fear and stigma that we had to overcome as entrepreneurs coming into the space. There's always the question of, is my tech going to work? Is my idea good enough? This is a unique challenge because cannabis is so heavily stigmatized. It has been for the last 80 years. There's very little standardization. So when you talk to doctors, when you talk to pharmacists, when you talk to researchers, they don't understand cannabis because it's not what's called a standardized molecular drug or an API. This is a plant-based medicine that changes based on cultivation. It changes based on the way you handle it. It's a very good medicine, but it's not understood. So this is further complicated by the fact that in Canada, we've had compassionate access for some time, and it was a medicine that was voted into existence by the courts, and it did not follow any clinical rigor, much in the way we do for any other drug that you put in your body. So the way most people think about cannabis, or the modern industry thinks about it, is that cannabis use makes you immoral. Deadbeats use cannabis. No one ever amounted to anything. I can tell you that the reality is actually quite the opposite. And what we are doing is we're studying the interaction of cannabis on the human body. For those of you that don't know, you have an endocannabinoid system, which is a physiological system which is designed to interface with cannabis and cannabinoids. And there's a very large base of science that's growing on this, but the problem is doctors are apprehensive because there's no clinical research. So what we wanted to do was to set out to design a series of technology tools that would allow us to crowdsource this data so that we can not only better help individuals who are looking to get better care, but we could also impact commercial producers to better help them understand who their customers are and what their needs are and how they can change up their product mix to better meet the needs of their evolving patient base. Cannabis is a really big market. We're kind of fortunate in Canada because we have a unique program that allows us to do things like study the use of cannabis on the population, and we have a government that allows companies like us to take on projects like this. The technology that we're putting together is putting Canada on the forefront of this area of science, but what you can see is that the market is rapidly going. I mean, in Europe alone, they're forecasting $80 billion in value for cannabis sales. All of this sales, they need ERP systems, they need customer feedback systems, they need customer care, they need core plumbing and infrastructure, which is what, I'm about as new as dirt. And this is stuff that's been coming up from the last 30 years. Everything that's old is new again. It's about applying the lessons that we've learned into the Wild West. Okay? So it starts with understanding your customer needs. Okay, so who would ever thought that, Elon Musk would be on on Joe Rogan, smoking pot. We need to understand when we're looking at the subset of this user population that there's substantial difference between medical users and rec users. They have different needs. You're restricted from making any representations about product anywhere. Social media networks restrict us. Government regulators are putting policies in place to protect consumers, but it actually blocks the advancement of competitors. So the outcome of this is that the illicit market continues to grow and is very strong. So what technology companies need to do entering the space is they need to do what any normal tech company would do, and that's to follow the product development process. Because this is a new emerging market, that often starts with market research, and that is kind of the niche that we've looked to follow. But don't cut corners. Spend your time speccing things out and learning from precedent and what your customers are saying. What we've done in this case is we've built a bunch of crowdsourced communities that roll their anonymous data up to a cloud that provides decision support. When we gather data like this, what we're able to do is to profile products so consumers have better understanding of what they're putting into their bodies. We can optimize formulations, provide competitive intelligence, and develop the general knowledge base around cannabis. So imparting, if I can leave you with some sage advice from a guy that's been through the ringer a couple of times, starting with Y2K. The current market environment is completely cyclical. And this is a cycle that we see going through a number of industries. As industry veterans in technology, this has happened. We have a bubble that has seemed to have burst in the medical and recreational cannabis market, but it's going to be rebuilt. Much in the way that we talked about, the difference between a stage B and a stage C investment is about proving the thesis and that it scales. The market is in the point where it needs to prove its thesis based on reasonable economics and pricing indicators to grow. Don't fall prey to founderitis. There's no way that your shit doesn't stink. You need to keep that in check. Data exists around you. Other companies, other smart people around you that you can check things with. Talk to these people. They're your market. They know best. Don't develop in a vacuum. The other thing that you should never underestimate is that common sense is in short supply. So there's a lot of whacked out valuations. Everyone thinks they know better, but if it doesn't check out, if it's not logical, if it doesn't make sense, it's probably too good to be true. So be articulate and understand. And the other thing that I can tell you for any of you that are looking to enter into the cannabis industry, which is an incredibly rapidly growing industry that is international, is the tactics that you take for modern software development, media development, consumer packaged goods and analytics, fintech analytics, those lessons that you learn are directly applicable in this new industry. So, if I can leave it at that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope I've helped you on your journey to be mindfully medicated. And thanks, I'm Dave from Strainprint.
Stand up for that standing ovation. Get high.
Thank you.
We'll take 2 questions. You cannot ask what's your favorite strain. But you can.
I can?
I mean, you can just
it's
say
probably a Della Haze, a Lemon Haze. Most of the software was developed on that, but that's another story.
Hi, this is Henry here, and I just had a question regarding how you collect data right here.
Sure. Hey.
So how do you authenticate the data is coming from, the source that you want them to come from? Like, how does that work?
So we wanted to set out to reduce keying error and increase the accuracy of the system. So what we did was we took all of that out of the hands of the customer. That meant we had to integrate with the ERP systems that were doing the stocking. We had to integrate with the labs to make sure we had the right chemical composition, because what we're actually doing is the work that we're doing is used to drive formulation for next generation products. It's used in physicians' office to help them track patient interaction in real time. And companies like Shoppers Drug Mart use our software to guide product recommendations. So if you're a patient with Shoppers and you call in, to their call center and have questions, they're interfacing with our knowledge base to make a recommendation for a product for you. So we query patients in real time through a mobile journaling app, and they interface with our network multiple times a day to tell us how they're feeling. And we, of course, incentivize them to do so.
Over here, Dan.
Dave.
Hey, in the back, Tim
Yeah.
Rice from the States. So what's your strategy about infiltrating the 380 million people that we got? I love your product. You and I have already linked in.
Yeah.
And I'm very curious. I know the Constellations of brand family that bought, into one of the large.
Yeah.
So what's the status of the Canadian market? I hear that you can't get the supply. And
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm happy to do that with you. I mean, there's regulations. It's
Yes.
federally illicit in the U.S. In Canada, it's legal.
Right.
You have to take a state-by-state approach. So
Yes.
there's actually 33 unique markets in the U.S. So the only way to do that effectively as a Canadian, because Canadian companies typically undercapitalize relative to their American peers, it's true. Is to look for leverage-based opportunities. So those are strategic relationships where you can minimize the cost of sales and marketing in a regional market where they can have a perpetual right to market or represent your product. That's the most viable way to do it cost effectively.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.